MPH at the George Washington University Milken Institute of Public Health with a specific focus on environmental health science and policy. In her current role, she researches climate perspectives in the United States and reports on how attitudes have changed year over year. Nicole is a recent co-author of the Mental Health in Our Changing Climate report, released by ecoAmerica and the American Psychological Association. Before we get started, I put a link in the chat and we have an interactive part of this presentation. So if you will open that link, we can go ahead and get started.
Thanks so much, Rachel. The poll that we'll do, I'll open it up on my screen in about 3 or 4 slides. So you can wait to take it then, or you can do it now, whatever works best for you. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this breakout session on climate change and mental health. And thank you to the whole Bridges to Access team, including the University of Oklahoma College of Medicine, College of Public Health, for making this event happen and for inviting me to speak today. So like we've both said, this breakout will be focused on mental health and climate change. So during this session, I'll start with a brief introduction about who I am. I'll go over the report titled Mental Health in Our Changing Climate that I'll be discussing quite a bit of the findings from today. We'll dive into the context, the impacts of climate change on mental health, inequities, solutions, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers. And I also want to add in this discussion that sensitive topics, including sexual assault and suicide, will be briefly mentioned on the slides. So I just give that as a warning and as an opportunity for anyone who doesn't feel comfortable to switch breakout sessions at any point during the presentation. It's totally acceptable to leave. So Rachel gave a really great introduction, but I always think it's more fun to listen to these Zoom talks and presentations when you know who's talking to you. So like Rachel said, my name is Nicole Hill. I'm the Research and Marketing Manager at ecoAmerica. And in my role, I primarily work on researching American attitudes on climate change and how they change over years, in addition to some marketing initiatives. I received my Master's of Public Health from the George Washington University Milken Institute School of Public Health, and I had a specific focus there on environmental health science and policy. And so during that time, it felt like mental health was really starting to be recognized as a critical component of public health. But I remember when I first started studying climate change as it related to public health, we weren't talking a lot about the mental health impacts. And the discussions really circulated more around the physical health impacts. So I hope that this presentation really glues together that connection for everybody listening, because it's not something to breeze over. And then, like Rachel said, I'm also co-author of Mental Health in Our Changing Climate. It chronicles the impacts of climate change on Americans' mental health and psychological well-being, and it provides guidance and resources to act and advocate. It was published in November of last year by ecoAmerica and the American Psychological Association, and it is what I'll be basing this session off of, so I'll be referring to it quite a bit. And here's the report just for reference. I hope to get to everybody's questions by the end, but if I don't, it's a great resource to look for answers to. Okay, so now I'm actually going to close my slides and I'll ask everybody to use the link that Rachel sent around. I'm going to reshare my screen with the poll that's up, and we can take a look at everybody's responses. Let's see. All right, so the first question was, how much of a priority is climate change for you? It looks like, Rachel, do you know if these are percentages or numbers?
I think it's numbers.
Okay.
We have about 100 people, and I can send the link for the Menti poll one more time.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'll give folks a minute or two to answer. There's 3 questions. Okay, so it looks like about 6 of you say that climate change is a top priority. 38 are saying that it's very important. 26 are saying somewhat important, and only 3 folks are saying that it's not a priority to them. Okay, we can go on to, is this a different link for the second question, Rachel?
Let me see. I think it is the same link. Yes, same link. It should just refresh on your page.
Great. It's very fun to see the active answering. Okay, so as of now, nobody has said that climate change is a top priority for within their classes or their institution. That's interesting. Okay, so for the last one, we had only 3 folks saying that it wasn't a priority for them. And now 34 people are saying that it's not a priority for their classes or institution. So it's interesting to see that gap there. And I'll move on to the last question. I can quickly go over this. So this is slightly different. How much of a priority is climate change and mental health within your classes or institution? Okay, so once the mental health piece is added to the question, it looks like a little bit more of a priority within your classes. Still 24 people are saying it's not a priority at all. It's interesting. Okay. So overall, it seems like generally the participants in our group today are feeling like personally climate change is more of a priority to them than it is for your classes and for your institution. So thanks everybody for engaging in that. I always think polling is a really fun way to get big Zoom calls together and everybody active. So let me get back to my slides. Just give me one moment. Okay, great. So now I'm going to offer a little bit of context before we dive into the explicit impacts of climate change on mental health. I think it's really important to provide an overview of the links between physical, mental, and community health. And you can actually find this image on the screen on page 16 and 17 of the report if you do choose to read it later. The important message here is that while climate change directly impacts all 3, we must remember too that individual mental health is connected to our physical health. Physical health impacts mental health, and community mental health is affected by both. The influence also illustrates that not all Americans are affected equally. There are certain people who are made more vulnerable, which we will discuss in a moment. But just to illustrate, imagine you're a person with asthma, let's say, and as our climate changes, you experience more frequent asthma episodes. This can cause you stress and anxiety, and because your activities are more limited, can even lead to depression. So given the rise in incidence of asthma overall, not only you, but others in your community may be experiencing the same symptoms. And understanding the interconnectedness can help us better plan to protect our mental health as the climate changes. It can also help us create more effective climate policies that consider mental health and well-being. And another aspect of climate change and mental health is who has access to the decision making. For example, if you live in a community experiencing disinvestment, or maybe you're too young to vote, but you're not too young to understand what is happening around you, you may become frustrated and isolated if you can't influence the systemic change. So not to jump ahead here on solutions, because that's another section later in the presentation, but I encourage you to think about the ways that you solicit and incorporate community feedback, or maybe feedback from your patients or future patients in your climate actions. So many reports show a rise in concern about climate change among Americans. ecoAmerica research last year found that 78% of Americans were concerned about climate change, with 48% being very concerned, yet only 59% of Americans believed that others around them were concerned about climate change. And actually, in a report released just about 2 weeks ago, we saw the gap in actual versus perceived concern grow. So the more recent survey showed that 45% said that they were personally or very concerned about climate change, but only 14% thought that others were very concerned about climate change around them. So it's 3 times as many people are very concerned than people think. And the gap in actual versus perceived climate concern could be contributing to silence on the issue too, because people may feel alone in their concern. They're afraid to step out of their group's norms. And that's called pluralistic ignorance, which is a psychological barrier to action. And we'll dive into that in the next slide. So even though most adults in the United States express concern about climate change and a majority favor efforts to ensure a sustainable planet for future generations, it has translated into the personal and political action necessary for solutions at scale. So there's several psychological barriers holding back action on climate, and these include psychological distance. This refers to the idea that climate change is a distant worry. It's something that will happen to others at a future date, but perceived as something that won't harm you right now. And even though concern is high, only 45% of Americans say that they're personally at risk of harm from climate change. So this sense that climate change is a distant problem creates a barrier to personal and public engagement on the climate crisis. Belief systems too play a huge role in how we think about climate change. Many proposed climate solutions, such as large-scale government programs, conflict with political worldviews that prioritize limited government power. And this explains in part why a conservative political identity, for instance, has become a predictor of climate change skepticism. Pluralistic ignorance, as I just noted, is the idea in which people's ideas about what a group thinks can differ from what group members truly think, and that can inhibit the acknowledgement of a problem too. So fractured hope, those who lack hope that climate change can be fixed and believe that there's no way that the climate crisis can be solved are actually less likely to take action on the issue. And it's an important ingredient in proactive response to believe that the solutions work and that climate change can be addressed. So fractured hope can get in the way of action. And then finally, the need for efficacy. So studies suggest that we need to both believe in ourselves, that we have the ability to take necessary actions, that's self-efficacy, and that those actions will result in helping solve the climate change, which is outcome efficacy. But the good news is that these barriers can be overcome with visible leadership and action on climate by people Americans know and trust in their daily lives. One study found that people were far more likely to get involved in public sphere action, such as donating money, contacting policymakers, if they believed that their social group was also participating. And visible leadership and action from health professionals, I'm kind of jumping to the last bullet here, may also prove to be helpful. Earlier this year, 68% of adults in the United States said that they trusted health professionals as a source of climate change information. Personal experience with impacts, or even better yet, personal experience with solutions, is an important climate attitude that can change action. People who are feeling the effects of climate change today, and often after experiencing an extreme event, it'll stay salient in their mind. People in the United Kingdom who had experienced severe flooding not only felt more at risk from climate change, but they also expressed greater support for policies that address climate change. And then finally, helping people see the connection between climate and their family's health. So both on the impacts of climate change, but again, better yet, on the benefits of solutions to support our health can really change behavior. So providing information about the personal health benefits of specific climate mitigating behaviors can lead to greater expressed willingness to adopt those behaviors, such as replacing driving with other forms of transportation or eating vegetarian meals. And talking about those connections doesn't necessarily need to be centered on climate change. So discussions can focus on what's impacting the community of focus. So like hurricanes or heat waves, you can talk about it in that language without actually using the words climate change too. So for the next slides, I'm going to briefly summarize some of the information from the report on the mental health impacts of climate change. I'll start with severe weather impacts. I'll move to the slower chronic impacts of climate change, and then I'll talk about climate anxiety, which some of you may have heard of before. Right now, the term is receiving a lot of traction. So we'll dive into that too. So because of climate change, the number of severe weather and disastrous events is climbing every year. So between hurricanes, flooding, extreme rainfall events, wildfires, other impacts, there's hardly a region of the United States that hasn't been impacted. These events have real personal impacts that can harm mental health, and these include trauma and shock. So direct trauma from extreme events can occur. That can be through personal injury, maybe injury of a loved one or family member, loss of property, loss of pets and livelihood. PTSD rates are found to be as high as 30 to 40% among disaster exposed people, and it can last for years. And other impacts include anxiety and depression, increased stress-related physical health problems, strains on social relationships, within households, psychological distress, can have serious consequences. A number of studies have actually found that violence in the home, including domestic abuse and child abuse, often increases in families who have experienced disasters. Experiencing an extreme weather event also uproots communities, and it weakens social to be temporarily displaced and unable to experience their usual social interactions. This is really important because a supportive social context is strongly associated with both physical and mental health. So without these social connections, people are increasingly vulnerable to stress. Experiencing a disaster so intense that one needs to leave their home and leave their community can be particularly traumatic, and displacement is linked to higher rates of PTSD along with negative mental health outcomes such as anxiety and depression. I know a lot of people either personally have had to evacuate from wildfires recently, tornadoes and severe storms, and a lot of people have families that might have been in the California and Colorado wildfires. So this one, I think, at least this year, has been particularly personal for a lot of folks. And losing one's community, either because it's destroyed in a hurricane or wildfire, or because of displacement, it threatens people's sense of belonging and their identity. People are often not aware that the chronic impacts of climate change are also really dangerous. So there's 3 types I'll talk about today. I'll talk about heat, drought, and poor air quality. Heat affects mental health because it's a psychological stressor. So increased temperatures are linked to mood and anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, vascular dementia, and greater use of emergency mental health services. Drought causes psychological distress, including generalized anxiety and depression, particularly for farmers and farming communities or people who are economically affected. Prolonged drought has actually been linked to farmer suicides around the world too. The factors that contribute to climate change, particularly the burning of fossil fuels, also contribute to air pollution, such as increased particulate matter. So those little tiny particles. I think most of you are med students, so I'm sure you're familiar with little particles that can get really deep inside your lungs and harm you. So air pollution can increase the risk of anxiety and other mental disorders. It impairs cognitive function and predicts lower ratings of happiness and life satisfaction. There's evidence as well that air pollution has long-term impacts on children's cognitive development and mental health. And finally, there's 2 other ways that these chronic impacts of climate change affect people's mental health by changing the places that people live so dramatically through sea level rise, for example, or species loss, that people lose their sense of place, their sense of attachment, and even to some extent, their sense of self and sense of control over their lives too. So the chronic impacts of climate change can also have community level outcomes beyond just those personal outcomes that we're talking about. One is a loss of culture and tradition. This has been particularly studied in cold climate Indigenous communities that have been affected by rapidly rising temperatures. Indigenous peoples often report a strong attachment to the land, even a sense of relationship to it, and it can be important to the traditional practices and their foods. So warmer temperatures due to climate change prevent long-standing cultural practices. And then a second community level outcome is an increase in hostility and conflict. So rising temperatures have been linked to interpersonal aggression and violence, including domestic violence, assault, rape, and even murder. And converging evidence change may be contributing to intergroup violence, such as political conflict and war. Okay, so on to climate anxiety. Even among people who haven't including fear, anger, feelings of powerlessness, exhaustion. In 2020 survey by the American Psychological Association, about 2/3 of respondents said that they had felt at least a little bit of this kind of anxiety, and about 1/4 of them said that they had felt it a lot. So negative emotions about the climate crisis don't constitute mental illness, but watching the slow and seemingly irrevocable impacts of climate change unfold and worrying about them, worrying about the future for oneself, worrying about your children, later generations, it can be a source of stress and sadness, and that's referred to as climate anxiety. Climate anxiety does and international research shows that negative emotions about climate change are mental health. So it is important to note that while the destructive impacts of climate change will be felt by everybody in some way, the burdens of climate change will fall most heavily on those oppressed by historic and present day social, economic, and political power dynamics. Climate change is already a destabilizing force that exacerbates pre-existing socially determined vulnerabilities. And so that makes some populations more prone to the mental health difficulties of it. For example, one of these populations is those who are economically disadvantaged. Living in poverty is a risk factor of its own. It's linked to poor physical health, greater likelihood of being the victim of a crime or of another form of violence, and higher risk of depression and anxiety. Individuals with serious mental illness may also be more likely to be unhoused or less likely to regulate their own behavior in response to a dangerous environmental condition. And then add this to the fact that economically advantaged people are more likely to be exposed to a disaster because poverty pushes people to live in areas with higher disaster risk. And in the aftermath of a disaster, those with lower wealth have less access to actually the material resources that help people cope and recover. So all of these factors contribute to the higher risk of stress, higher risk of depression and anxiety experienced by poor people after a disaster. Another community is community of colors. So discrimination and systemic racism in the United States expose racial and ethnic populations that have been marginalized to a wide array of environmental risks, while simultaneously also denying them access to the financial and political resources that could help buffer the impacts of climate change. One stark example of this is how historical discriminatory housing policies, such as redlining and racially restrictive covenants, have forced people of color to live in dangerous heat-prone areas. Formerly redlined neighborhoods in the United States tend to have lower tree cover, less green space, more concrete, and that makes them significantly hotter. So this not only increases the health risk from high temperatures, but it also deprives the communities of the health buffer offered by urban areas with high concentrations of people with color has led to outdated infrastructure, such as inadequate warning systems for extreme weather, poor flood preparedness, and clogged or deteriorating storm sewer systems. These infrastructure failures expose residents to more of the physical impacts of climate change, which in turn make it more likely that their mental health and that their well-being will also be affected. All of these factors put a heavier burden on Americans of color, making them more susceptible to depression, anxiety, and psychological distress brought on by climate impacts. Indigenous communities threatened by climate change are found around the world and in the United States, including Alaska, where villages are literally vanishing as permafrost thaws, and also in the Gulf Coast, where the shoreline is eroding. Being forced to relocate because of climate change, or even the thought of having to relocate because of climate change, causes significant stress. It weakens social connections and it increases levels of conflict within the community. Climate change threatens Indigenous ways of life in numerous other ways too. Indigenous personal and cultural identity is often directly tied to the land through history and through lived experience. So when the land is irrevocably altered, it deeply impacts those who are connected to the land. Shifts in climate and weather affect Indigenous communities' food security too, their traditional cultural practices, and their attachment to place. So it's not surprising, but it is still extremely troubling that recent studies indicate that suicide, depression, and anxiety among Indigenous populations in North America are linked to both acute and chronic weather events. And another population that's made vulnerable to the mental health impacts of climate change are children. So nearly half of the world's children, which is about 1 billion children, it's a lot of children, currently live in countries considered to be at extremely high risk to the impacts of climate change. There's no question that experiencing an extreme natural disaster or having to be displaced from one's home exposes a child to high levels of stress, and that has lifelong ramifications. It can affect the development of neural pathways that impair memory. It can impact executive function and decision-making later in life, and that can all result in higher levels of stress and anxiety. Climate change-related disasters will affect children through the stress and trauma of an extreme event. Some studies find that children experience PTSD to a greater degree too than adults do. Climate change will impact children in less direct ways too. For example, their schooling may be interrupted. They may also be impacted by the vicarious experiences and mental health of their caregiver. In addition, food insecurity is exacerbated by climate change, and malnourishment during the early years is associated with later behavioral and motor problems, lower intelligence test scores, fewer years of schooling, and reduced economic activity. And so children are especially vulnerable because if you think about it, children often have to rely on others, their parents, their social connections, their caregivers, their communities to ensure their own well-being. And that puts them in a very vulnerable spot. So additional populations that are made vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, to the mental health impacts of climate change, that I don't have time to dive into today, but they are outlined in the report. These include older adults, women, people with disabilities, individuals with pre-existing mental health diagnoses, and outdoor workers. So I do encourage you to take a look in the report to dive deeper into any of those populations that you're interested in. Okay, so here's the good part, the fun part. So while the impacts of climate change on mental health are profound, solutions are also abundant and they're accessible. Mental health benefits to climate change can include improved mood, improved social behavior, cognitive function, academic performance, and the sense of control, agency, and well-being. It can reduce stress, anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And local solutions can also enhance community cohesion and resilience. So this can really be thought of in terms of your local community, whether that's your town, your city, your school, institution. You can think about it in all those ways. So in terms of promoting resilience in individuals, we can all prioritize our own mental health as we work to address climate change. Here are some suggestions for building resilience in individuals. Each one is described in more detail in the report, and these are meant for individuals who want to bolster their own personal capacities. They're also helpful for mental health professionals and other health professionals who support other people in building their own personal resilience, maybe their household resilience, like caregivers. So these include build belief in one's own resilience, foster optimism and hope, cultivate active coping and self-regulation, bolster interpersonal sources of support, encourage connection and care for children, find a source of personal meaning, boosting personal preparedness, and when the health and safety allow for it, upholding connection to place. Promoting resilience in communities. So a strong community can also be a source of stability and a source of safety for its residents. All of us fare better when we perceive the world around us as orderly, predictable, benevolent. And as we know, an individual's ability to mitigate disaster risk is profoundly shaped by the policies and decisions made by those in power at the community, state, and federal levels. With that in mind, here's a set of suggestions for how communities can create conditions that make life better for everyone, in particular, those who have been made most vulnerable in the past. So it includes steps like expanding response and resilience plans, addressing inequities, strengthening mental health services, updating physical infrastructure, and developing an effective warning system. Meaningful local climate solutions are also within reach. Communities can take thousands of actions on climate that benefit mental health. And here's just a few ideas to get started. You can inspire change by making a public commitment to climate solutions. You can feature it online. You can feature it in your communications, focusing on the benefits and the cost savings that people in your community will realize with the solutions, and how investing today can make the community stronger. You can also aim for quick successes with easily achievable and affordable steps that can be put in place quickly. You can establish priorities and make informed plans with goals for energy efficiency, renewable energy, electric and active transportation and mass transit, waste reduction. You can engage and communicate with leaders in business, education, mental health, and faith. Those who are already making the communities are already making the commitments to climate solution in ways that aren't politicized. Embedding solutions and recycling the savings is also a good one. So climate and sustainability solutions should be part of ongoing business of local governance, not like a separate project dealt with somewhere else. Like it can merge together. And the initial savings from reducing energy and water use, for example, those can be used to support the next steps of a plan. And then you can build on and adapt your results. So these climate plans can always be adjusted, and they should be adjusted as new opportunities arise. All right, so in what individuals can do. So all of us, individual people, we can take tangible actions at home and in the community to help mitigate climate change and prepare for its impacts. These actions in turn can provide a greater sense of security and a greater sense of self-efficacy. So examples include having an emergency plan, creating an emergency kit with meaningful personal items included that can help with the sense of self and sense of security. Understanding your own medical needs, you can write them down. Also make sure that's included in the kit. Bolster your health and well-being by learning new resiliency skills, staying physically active, and sharing concerns with others. Actively reduce your own climate impact too. And what individuals can do in the community. So we all have more power than we think to affect progress at the community level. So we don't have to wait for somebody else to do it. We can all be the ones that we've been waiting for today and start now. A good baseline is to develop and maintain social connections with your neighbors and with other community members. Discuss with them like the benefits of solutions to health and the other benefits that come on with climate solutions. Support policy solutions with advocacy, letting your elected officials know that you expect ambitious solutions from them and pushing to make them enact those into law. You can bring people together for collaboration or for a community resilience project, or you can even join an existing group working on the solutions. Maybe there's one already in your community that's taking action, and you can join and be part of that. And also for those of you who are able to, you can vote. That's another way to take action in the community. Okay, and then what mental health professionals can do, and these steps can be for general health professionals at large, not just mental health professionals, but you can do any of the steps that are already covered. It's important as health professionals to also care for yourself and take the steps for individual resilience. But as local health leaders, your community also looks to you for information and for advice. So you can become a climate literate professional, learn and stay up to date on climate change and the impacts on mental health, like you're already doing today. But also the first step in climate leadership starts with literacy. So learn how climate change impacts mental health and the ways that you can protect it. Engage other health and mental health professionals to share your knowledge or collaborate with them on programs or research. Climate leadership can extend to fellow mental health colleagues, many of whom are also just as concerned, even though we think people around us aren't as concerned as they are. And they would probably they'd probably appreciate being invited to engage on the issue too. You can be a visible and local leader within your community by giving talks, participating in events, or serving on planning committees for resilience or climate action plans. Individuals in the mental health community really have a respected platform to influence and mobilize climate change discussions. We actually had somebody take our report and start it as a book club. And that was one way that they were getting mental health and climate change out into their community and really discussing it with their peers. You can also support national and international solutions, again, thinking about what you can implement and building on the large scale systemic change. Health and climate experts are really trusted professionals that have the power to influence policy makers at all levels of government. Like I said earlier, the majority of Americans actually trust health professionals for sources of climate change information. So you can be really powerful and a great resource for your patients or future patients when it comes to climate change and mental health. And now I'll open it up to the question and answer session. So I guess I can stop sharing my screen and we can all say hi all together.
We have about 10 minutes for questions, and we do ask that if you want to ask a question, please turn on your camera, and I'll keep track of time so we run on time.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And if nobody has questions, I can also provide some other ways to get involved too, specific for health professionals too, but I'll wait to see if anything's marinating in someone's mind that they want to bring up. I'll give everybody a second.
I can kick us off too. When you were in school, what specifically drew you to mental health and climate change?
So I actually, my interest in climate change came first, for sure. I realized, I think it was maybe my second semester of undergraduate, I took a public health course and our instructor had a theme that everything was public health. And so I was kind of between studying, I was really interested in environmental science. I thought that was the route that I was going to go down. And I realized in that class that environment and public health were so closely linked, and climate change was a huge piece in that. So I had grown an interest in studying climate change. I wasn't totally sure what I wanted to do with it, whether it was like my dad has worked outside his entire life. So I was really interested in occupational health and how climate change influences the construction industry. And then I had one professor who came in and didn't touch on climate change at all, but the whole lecture was just on mental health and about it enough. And people are siloed in their mental health struggles. And that was like the first time that it kind of clicked for me, that I was like, there are so many stressors in our world on an everyday basis, and they're only getting worse with climate change. And so the two are really linked and interconnected. And so before I joined ecoAmerica, the team had written a report in 2017, and it was the first version of the mental health and climate change report. And it was really well received among both environmentalists and health professionals. And within the past 4 years, there was so much research growing in the area that we decided it was time to update it. So I was fortunate enough to be on the research team, and so they asked me to be part of that. And so I had a really great opportunity with some other researchers from Minnesota and from Ohio, and we had peer reviewers from all over the world. And so that was how I got involved in this particular project. But it was really like the idea that everything is public health. That was what connected it for me.
I had a question. So you were talking about like climate anxiety and stuff, and I've heard a lot of people that I know, that have anxiety about that. I feel like that's really common, like you said, like becoming more common. And
Yeah.
one thing that comes up, like when I talk to people about that, is that they like don't want to have children because they're like just so afraid of like the world and climate and everything. And I was just curious if you know of like any research that has been done like with climate anxiety and like desire to have children, because I just find that really, really interesting and sad, honestly. But I was just curious if you knew anything about that.
It is so interesting. So I don't know of any studies in particular that are looking at attitudes and behaviors towards having children, like if studying parents in particular. There really should be, like, that's an area that should be expanded on, because I mean, if nobody's going to have children, like that's going to completely change community dynamics, family dynamics, political dynamics. Like, it is a really important piece of this. And I mean, I'll just, I'm very open talking about mental health. Like, I want to, get rid of the stigma. So I'll say it, like, I've thought about that. It's totally something that's been on my mind. And it is scary. Like, if I think about my next however many years within a changing climate, what's that going to look like? But then having a child, like, they're going to have so many more years, so it's totally, it's something that I've heard of too, and I've had a personal experience with, but not something I've seen heavy research done yet. Yeah, but I would encourage any of you too, if you're interested in this topic, to look for research opportunities within mental health and climate change. Either if you get like a climate change grant and you can explore it, focus on mental health, or vice versa, something in the health field, and then you can take it into the climate change realm. Thank you for that question.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, thank you so much. I find that really interesting. And I've also struggled with that too, because, I'm concerned about the climate. So thanks for sharing that. And hopefully there'll be more research, like you said, because it's very interesting.
Yeah, we had a question last week when I was talking about this report to somebody else, and they were curious of how to, rather than looking at climate anxiety as such a bad thing that we should feel ashamed about and try to push it away, to really accept it, and wondering like how can we kind of give ourselves some love and respect and like recognize that this reaction is really normal to all of these disasters. Like if you find out that your uncle is evacuating their house, it's a very human response to be concerned, and it's not necessarily something to try to rid of. And like climate anxiety is bad, we should get rid of it. It's like we should give ourselves a little bit of grace and a little bit of love and support each other in that.
I like that. Very true.
Yeah.
And we have a question in the chat as well from Barb. She says, are you aware of any efforts by Sierra Club or other such environmental groups regarding climate change and mental health?
Yeah, not Sierra Club in specifically. However, there are a lot of environmental groups that are starting to focus on mental health. So one in particular that's really involved in mental health is the Climate Psychiatry Alliance. And some of the psychiatrists involved in that were actually helping us write the report. So that's one place to look. There's also a group that might be particularly interesting to you all, the Medical Students for a Sustainable Future. We've worked quite a bit with, and I know that they do a lot of really great work trying to get climate change infused in medical schools and the classes and whatnot. I'm trying to think of others off the top of my head. I'm also happy to provide my email too to anybody if you have a question that comes up in the next few days and you want to email me about it.
What about like the National Conservancy, anything like that? I'm just surprised because so many of those groups are involved with policy. And I'm just curious to know if they've done anything with these efforts.
Yeah, so I don't want to say that they haven't, because it might be that I just haven't engaged with them in the work as much. I've seen, and I can't, again, I'm having trouble thinking of the environmental organizations off the top of my head, but a lot of folks are writing blogs and like talking about eco-anxiety, whether it's in terms of eco-grief or climate anxiety. The agreed upon term is not yet final. So a lot of environmental groups I have seen starting to talk about it in terms of like writing blogs, adding it to their newsletters. In terms of research, I'm not as familiar with environmental groups working on the subject, but they are too helping fund, I think, some of the research that's going on, whether they're doing it themselves. That's a really interesting question, especially, I know nonprofit status, of course, influences how much political sway you can have, but some of the groups that may be allowed to influence politically within their nonprofit status should definitely be working on this if they're not already.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, it looks like the breakout session is going to end in 50 seconds. So if anybody has last minute question, you can feel free to ask. Rachel, is it okay if I just put my email in if anybody wants to?
Absolutely, yeah. And like her contact information, go ahead and you can send me a DM on Zoom and I can facilitate for you for that as well.
Thanks so much. Thank you everybody for joining today and listening in on this. Hope you have a great rest of your breakout sessions.
Thank you so much for speaking. We were so excited to have you.
It was great to be here.